So I thought I would just sort of set the stage today for the conversation with about 4 or 5 slides, sort of covering major trends in the commercial solar industry. So Ira, if you want to go to my very first slide. First, what I thought we would do is just kind of take stock of the commercial solar market sort of as it stands today. I know there's like a lot on this slide, but I think it does a pretty good job of highlighting some of the major and important trends in commercial solar. I also just want to note that this slide includes data through just the end of 2019. I like to look at commercial solar data on an annual basis as opposed to on a quarterly basis. Not that it's not important to look at quarterly ups and downs and shifts in commercial solar, but I find that when I'm looking at some of these bigger, longer term trends, because commercial solar can be fairly lumpy, it's most valuable to look at that data on an annual basis. So the first thing that will probably pop out at you from this slide is that commercial solar projects have been getting bigger. It used to be the case that earlier than 2015, most projects, at least on a capacity basis, were under a megawatt in size. And now that's completely flipped. And most projects are over 1 megawatt in size. And part of what has driven that increase is also the growth of community solar. And maybe for those of you who aren't as familiar with the commercial segment, community solar projects are those where you might have a project located off-site, away from where the customer's actual building or location is. But then that one project will subscribe multiple customers and then allocate them bill credits. So there's lots of programs like this set up across the United States. Another big trend that this slide sort of highlights is that the bigger the project, the more likely it is to be third-party owned, and basically the easier that project has access to financing. Some of the bigger financiers and investors out there like to have larger transaction sizes, and they also like to have sort of the fixed costs of doing business spread out over sort of a larger project, and that makes some of those costs a little bit more easy to swallow. So that's kind of an important trend in the commercial solar industry. It's also really important in sort of the market of today to understand what's going on with corporate offtake agreements. And when I say corporate offtake agreements, what I tend to mean is when you have a large corporation, like say Amazon or Facebook, and they sign a power purchase agreement with a very large, utility scale solar project. They might sign a PPA for 50 to 100 megawatts of solar, for example. And at Wood Mac, we consider those actual projects to be sort of utility scale projects for the sake of segmenting out the industry. But of course, the customers of those projects are indeed commercial businesses. And more businesses these days are entering into those agreements, and they have become a bigger and bigger part of what it means for commercial businesses to go solar. So just as a bit of an indication of this trend, 2019 was the very first year in which the combination of community solar as well as corporate offtake agreements sort of surpassed the procurement from those more standard on-site commercial solar projects. And the customers of these agreements have also been getting more diverse. So it used to be the case in like 2016, 2017, that almost all of these deals were with big technology firms. So Microsoft, Amazon, Google, etc. But last year in particular, there was a much broader customer base. There were some industrial and retail and service firms that really started to make up a bigger share of those operating projects that were sort of corporate offtake agreements. So again, just to emphasize, there's no necessarily like right or wrong answer about like which one of these segments is best. It really depends on the customer and what type of financial or sort of like energy risk they might want to take. But the sort of major takeaway is that there's all these different options available to folks these days, and going solar can entail a bunch of different structures and a bunch of different ways to procure solar. So Ira, if you can go to the next slide. And now thinking a little bit in terms of the competitive landscape, commercial solar remains a fairly fragmented business. So the vast majority, about 95% of installers in the United States, do less than 5 megawatts of installations a year. And given today's average system sizes, that equates to about 20 deals or less per year. And this chart that I'm showing on this slide, this is an analysis of the share of companies that either grew or shrank from 2018 to 2019. And now, during that year, or from the shift from 2018 to 2019, the market did shrink by about 2%. So it's sort of logical that most of the companies, most of the active companies, their volumes also shrank. But you'll notice that some of the smaller installers, those that were doing 10 megawatts or less, proved to be slightly more resilient than the larger installers. And in my view, this kind of highlights the sweet spot that a lot of commercial solar installers occupy. So some of the companies that are sort of in that space include companies like maybe a HESP Solar or GeoPeak Energy or Dynamic Energy. And there's also a lot of sort of contractors and electricians that have sort of built up more of a local reputation, and they have sort of a regional scope, and they rely on sort of organic referral-based growth as opposed to really massive growth on a national scale. All that being said, though, the larger installers who do over 10 megawatts a year, while there's a lot fewer of them, they only make up about 3% of active installers. They did install about half of all capacity in 2019. So those installers make up a much larger share of the annual market. So sort of going back to some of the research that Tom had been referencing that I did earlier in the summer, I wanted to address, what's the potential of this industry? And the somewhat typical narrative in the commercial solar industry is that the segment is untapped and there's unlimited potential. But what exactly does that mean? So I did a collaboration with Station A. They are an awesome software company that aggregates data on all of the commercial buildings in the US that have over 10,000 square feet of roof space. And then I combined that with our own Wood Mackenzie commercial solar installation data. And what I found is that 3.5% of today's commercial buildings have sort of already been tapped for on-site solar. Another 1.5 or 1.1% can be accounted for through off-site projects like community solar subscriptions or some of those corporate offtake arrangements that I was mentioning earlier. And then finally, about 25% of the buildings in the US simply don't spend enough money on electricity in order to make commercial solar a sort of a viable proposition, meaning that it wouldn't hit the sort of the threshold of a 10% bill savings that commercial solar developers tend to look for. So what we're sort of left with at the end of the day is that 70% of commercial buildings in the United States are untapped, which equates to a little over 600,000 buildings and about 145 gigawatts of on-site solar potential. Now, granted, this doesn't necessarily take into account the challenges that are related to financing or the ownership of a building, et cetera, et cetera. The developers out there in the audience probably know exactly the types of challenges that I'm talking about. But it's still a very hefty potential market that seems worthwhile to try and overcome some of the barriers. And then finally, sort of looking forward, Ira, if you want to go to the next slide. This is our outlook for commercial solar over the next 5 years. Now, of course, the very first thing you're going to notice is that 2020 is going to shrink quite a lot thanks to the impacts from the pandemic. The biggest driver of this decrease is, of course, interconnection and permitting delays that were caused during Q2. We've heard quite a bit from developers in the space that because of pandemic-related delays, there's been usually 3 to 6 months lag in some of those typical project development steps. And of course, the sort of what's going to happen next year is that a lot of those projects, while they have been delayed, they'll come online in 2021 instead. We don't anticipate many actual project cancellations. So that sort of leads to the increase in 2021. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering about what about the sort of general economic slowdown and what impact is that going to have on commercial solar? We definitely expect that the economic conditions of today are going to create sort of a small decline in origination opportunities in commercial solar. But we have already started to hear from developers that origination has started to sort of reboot and recover, and that it didn't decline as much as folks originally had anticipated. So we are expecting quite a lot. We are expecting that there will continue to be some modest growth in this segment over the next couple of years. And then the dynamics that you can see in this forecast that start after about 2023 are related to the phase down of the ITC as those incentives go away. And then sort of the last thing that I wanted to emphasize is that commercial solar is really very highly dependent on state policy in order to create markets. So the 5 states that are listed here, those 5 states are going to make up half of the total outlook over the next 5 years for commercial solar. And this is really being driven by the fact that these states have incentive programs or policies in place that drive commercial solar and create really good market opportunities. And that sort of importance of state policy will continue to be the case over the next several years. And that's sort of the end of my formal
Nice.
remarks, Tom. So I'll hand it back to you.